been a pastor for a number of years, and I moved to Montana about a year ago, and some of you may remember maybe 10, 15 years ago when the Posse Comitatus and some groups like that were holed up in a ranch in central Montana, and was quite a terrible thing for several months. They were surrounded by the FBI, and so there were several other religious hard right-wing groups that were in the Church United and Triumphant, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, all these kind of groups were in Montana at that point in time. Well, they kind of faded away, but this past year, I know that IID is not a political group, so I shouldn't be saying any of this, but this last year, the Tea Party won almost everything in all the local elections for the legislature. And I think we're going to bring back a T-shirt that they had back in the Posse Comitatus days, and the T-shirt says, "Montana, at least the cows ain't crazy." So that's where I come from to provide dialogue this evening. There's not much of it in Montana these days. When Salatine and Marat called and talked to me about coming back, I said, "Well, what do you want me to talk about?" And they said, "Peace and, love and acceptance." I thought, how many hours do I have about that? What we see in the world today, I believe, is a horrendous lack of civil community. And we can wring our hands and complain about that reality, but what do you do about it? In the 1980s in Turkey, we're kind of like the 1960s in America. We had the peace and civil rights movements and the feminist movements and lots of turmoil and riots and so forth. It was worse in Turkey in the 80s. The right-wing students and the left-wing students, as I understand it, were literally killing one another on the campuses of the universities in Turkey. A man came along. His name was Fethullah Gulen. And he said to those kids, "Stop killing one another. Get a good education. Really look at yourself in terms of your morals and your values. And decide to live a human life." That's basically, as I understand it, what he said, both from what people have told me and from what I've read of the movement in those days. He had no power to force anybody to do that. No power. He made some wonderful friends who did well in business and asked him, "What can we do to help this movement that will bring real peace to our country?" He said the most important thing is schools. The most important thing is schools where young people of all sorts can come. Not just the rich kids. Not just the kids of the government officials. Where all kinds of kids can come from poor communities, poor families, and get a good education. And you know what? We want to teach them English because English is going to be the world language. And so some of these rich folks did that. They started, as I understand it, in Izmir, Smyrna, we call it in the West sometimes. They started establishing schools, and they did preschools, and they did grade schools, and they did high schools, and ultimately they did universities. I think I'm right. The number may not be right. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. 10,000 around the world at this time? Nobody knows for sure because, get this, it's not a centralized organization. And people are aware, I mean, how many different countries do we have represented by the Turkish members? How many from Turkey altogether? Just put up your hand if you're from Turkey. Any Turkmenistan people? Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, there we go, Azerbaijan. Where else? I mean, I've run into folks from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Turkish people who call themselves Kurds, Turkish people who call themselves Arabs. You know, that's what he said. He said, go start the schools. And start them emphasizing two things. Love, not romance, although I understand you can get a wedding arranged at times from some of those places. Not romance, but the kind of love that understands you can choose to do what's in somebody's best interest. And particularly, you can choose to do what's in the best interest of some other person whom you care for. You can choose to do that even if you don't like them. You can choose to act out a notion of love that we in the West generally identify with Jesus. But it doesn't belong to Jesus. It belongs to God. And so that kind of a notion of a love that the test for it is not somebody's feelings. The test for it is, are you witnessing to it in daily life? Are you kind? Are you humble? Do you listen, actually listen to other people? Those are the kind of tests. Are you doing something with your life that fits who you are, but helps the community be a better community? The other thing he talked about was acceptance. I don't have to agree with you to accept you. I don't have to accept everything you think to accept you. I don't have to affirm all your politics to accept you. But if we don't accept one another, we don't have a community. I was raised in Pennsylvania, and in 7th or 8th grade, we took a civics course. And that was supposed to teach us all about politics and the government and this and that and the other. One of the few things I remember from that class is that Pennsylvania was not a state. It was a commonwealth. And they got that idea from the Quakers. William Penn started Pennsylvania, and he said, what we're starting here is a community where we will be invested in one another's well-being. Acceptance, love, again, not romantic, but in a functional way. Now, we've all been watching on TV what happened in Egypt and what's happening in Libya and all those kinds of things. The people in Egypt that did what they did were not commanded to do that. They obviously weren't coordinated to do it because most of the people hung back until they saw whether it was really going to get wiped out or not, and then they joined the demonstrations. They were inspired to do that. Somebody challenged them. Challenged them in terms of ethics, in terms of morals, in terms of spirituality, in terms of their own existential situation. So that whether they knocked off one demonstrator didn't matter. Because the next one was also inspired. And the next one was inspired. And the next one was inspired. You see, governments do not create civil communities. Civil communities create governments. And Fethullah Gulen's genius was to be saying to those kids in Turkey, build a civil community, and it is more powerful than a government, than a business, than an army.